A suppressed ancient manuscript claims that humanity once had abilities we'd now call magic, myth, or the supernatural. But according to the text, these weren't natural human traits that evolved over time. They were something closer to weapons. The Book of Enoch says a lost civilization before the flood was handed direct access to the classified secrets of heaven itself, abilities that broke the normal rules of physics. This was knowledge that let early humans manipulate matter, master the elements, and push past the boundaries creation was supposed to have. That power didn't lift humanity into a golden age. It triggered a catastrophe so severe, so biologically damaging, that it forced God's hand toward a total reset of life on Earth. For centuries, the institutional church went out of its way to keep this story from you. The texts were buried. The narrative was voted out of the canon, because the truth about where these abilities came from and what they turned humanity into doesn't fit the traditional biblical story. And it all starts with an unauthorized, tightly coordinated descent onto a mountain peak long before the Great Flood. History places this moment in the days of Jared, a patriarch who lived in the 6th generation from Adam. 200 angels, beings whose job was watching over the early development of humanity, made a deliberate decision to abandon their post. We know them as the Watchers, but the mainstream church has sanded down their story. For centuries you've been told that the fallen angels' sin was simply lust, that they came down because they found human women attractive and wanted to take them as wives. You're taught this was a momentary lapse, a localized rebellion of the flesh. That's only a small piece of the truth. The Book of Enoch says the Watchers didn't just mate with humanity. They brought a sophisticated, unauthorized curriculum with them, a transfer of divine knowledge that changed the direction of human civilization for good. They didn't just break the rules of heaven. They handed the blueprints of creation to a species that had no way of handling them responsibly. Imagine giving nuclear launch codes and the schematics for quantum computing to a group of toddlers. That's roughly the scale of the leap the Watchers forced onto antediluvian humanity. It began on the summit of Mount Hermon, a real place that still exists today, straddling the border of modern Syria and Lebanon. The leader of the group, an entity named Semjaza, knew what they were about to do carried the ultimate penalty. According to the text, Semjaza hesitated, worried that he alone would end up bearing the punishment for this act of cosmic treason. So he made the other 199 Watchers bind themselves to him with a mutual oath, a pact sworn on the summit of that mountain. They would descend together, carry out the plan together, and take the consequences together. Once they crossed the line between the heavenly and earthly realms, they split humanity into groups and began teaching. Semjaza, who led the whole thing, taught what the text calls enchantments and root cuttings. This wasn't primitive herbalism or early farming. Early church fathers and later scholars read it as something closer to the discovery of psychoactive substances, the crafting of love potions, the manipulation of biology, and the casting of spells of bewitchment. He taught humans how to bend the natural world to their will. Another Watcher, Armoros, taught the opposite skill. He showed humans how to resolve and break those same enchantments, which effectively kicked off a spiritual arms race of spellcasting and countermeasures among the early civilizations. They also mapped out the restricted parts of the cosmos. A Watcher named Barakijal taught the secrets of astrology, showing humanity how to read the stars, not for navigation, but for divination. Horkabal revealed the hidden secrets of the constellations. Ezekiel passed on knowledge of the clouds and weather patterns, teaching humans how to predict and possibly influence meteorological events. Arakel instructed humanity in the signs of the earth, Shamsiel decoded the signs of the sun, and Sariel explained the precise course of the moon. To a modern ear, shaped by a post-enlightenment worldview, that might sound like basic astronomy and earth science. It sounds harmless. But the Book of Enoch is explicit that these were unauthorized revelations. The text says the Watchers were revealing eternal secrets which were kept in heaven, which men were striving to learn. This wasn't public knowledge. It was, in effect, the underlying source code of reality, and it was never meant to leave heaven. And no one pushed this forbidden technology further or faster than a watcher named Azazel. Azazel is a figure so destructive that his name later became attached to the idea of the ultimate scapegoat in Israelite ritual. According to the 8th chapter of the Book of Enoch, Azazel is the one credited with transforming humanity from a scattered pastoral society into a militarized, bloodthirsty empire. Azazel taught men how to extract metal from the earth and turn it into weapons. Before him, human conflict was crude. He taught the metallurgy needed to forge hardened swords, sharp knives, solid shields, and interlocking breastplates. He showed humanity what was buried beneath the dirt and how to refine it into instruments of death. But Azazel's teaching went further than that, into the psychological and biological manipulation of the human body. He introduced cosmetology, the use of antimony to darken the eyelids, the crafting of ornate jewelry, and the working of precious stones and coloring tinctures. That sounds trivial next to forging swords, but ancient theology took it seriously. It was seen as an artificial alteration of the human form, an attempt to reshape human biology to produce unnatural seduction. Some Greek manuscript traditions of the Book of Enoch go further and claim this specific knowledge of beautification and adornment is exactly what let human women seduce the other celestial angels in turn, which makes humanity a willing participant rather than only a victim. Humanity wasn't slowly progressing anymore through ordinary trial and error. People were suddenly wielding abilities that had no place in the natural order. The knowledge the fallen angels handed down didn't elevate human society. It corrupted it at the root. The Watcher's instruction led directly to widespread unrighteousness, godlessness, and a systemic corruption of the planet. Men became powerful, arrogant, and detached from their creator. The natural boundaries of creation were being violated constantly. The world was turning into something unrecognizable, an advanced, technologically driven place built on knowledge that was never meant to reach human hands. Soon we'll see how this reckless spread of divine technology led to a biological catastrophe, severe enough that God chose to reset all terrestrial life. But first, there's the physical result of this union to reckon with. Because humanity didn't just pick up new skills, it began to alter its own genetics. The offspring of the Watchers and human women weren't simply strong men. They weren't just legendary kings or great warriors. They were a hybrid race, born of both mortal flesh and immortal heavenly spirit. We know them as the giants, the Nephilim, the Gibborim, the Reframing. Most people read the short, cryptic passage in Genesis chapter 6 and assume these giants were just unusually tall people, maybe a few feet taller than the average ancient man. The canonical Bible gives them barely 3 verses before moving quickly into the story of Noah. But the texts found hidden in the caves of Qumran paint a darker, far more detailed picture of a world overrun by apex predators. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947, archaeologists found fragments of a badly damaged document known as the Book of Giants. This text works as a direct companion to the Book of Enoch, sharing overlapping history about the same antediluvian period, and it fills in a lot of what the Bible leaves out about the days before the flood. The Book of Giants expands on a difficult reality. The Watchers didn't just abandon their posts and scatter. They organized themselves. The 200 angels, led by Shemaiah and Azazel, set up a ruling council and began governing humanity and their monstrous offspring directly. The scale of these beings was hard to grasp. Some ancient Ethiopian translations use symbolic numbers, claiming they stood thousands of ells tall, but the core claim across the manuscripts is consistent. Their physical size and strength were unmatched by anything in the natural world. They combined the advanced intellect of their celestial fathers with an insatiable appetite inherited from their human mothers. Together, the Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch explain how wickedness became so widespread that the earth itself began to react. Armed with the metallurgy Azazel provided, The Nephilim built armories that were nearly impossible to defeat. Armed with the spellcraft Semjaza had taught, they manipulated the natural elements. They were, effectively, unstoppable. But their real threat wasn't their weapons, it was their hunger. The Book of Enoch describes an escalation of consumption. As the giants multiplied and grew, their caloric needs became more than humans could sustain. First, the giants consumed everything humans produced, every crop, every harvest, every stockpile of food. When humans could no longer feed them, the giants turned on the animal kingdom. They sinned against birds, against beasts, against reptiles, and against fish, devouring the natural fauna of the earth and pushing the ecosystem toward collapse. When the animals were gone, the progression reached its logical, terrible conclusion. The giants turned on humanity itself. They began to devour mankind. The texts describe them drinking the blood of their victims, a direct violation of divine law on the sanctity of life. Eventually, they turned on each other too, in a kind of cannibalism among their own kind. This wasn't a primitive society of cavemen hitting each other with rocks. It was an advanced civilization operating on forbidden cosmic science, ruled by giant hybrids who treated natural humans as nothing more than a food source. The righteous shrank in number as the world filled with corruption, violence, and evil. The earth itself cried out and brought accusations against the wrongdoers. The souls of the dead cried out from the ground, demanding justice from the gates of heaven. This changes how we read the Great Flood. Taken on its own, the canonical Bible can make the global flood feel like a harsh, disproportionate punishment for generalized human bad behavior. Skeptics often use the flood story to paint the God of the Old Testament as angry and vindictive, but the Enochian texts reveal a different, more clinical logic behind the deluge. The flood wasn't simply a punishment for moral failure. It was closer to a tactical, biologically necessary quarantine. God had to wipe the board clean. Humanity's genetic code had been compromised on a massive scale. The bloodline of Adam had nearly been erased, save for one small, genetically uncorrupted remnant, Noah and his family. The world was dominated by hybrid giants wielding cosmic secrets they were never supposed to hold. The Book of Giants supplies the reasoning for why God was justified in sending that flood. It was, in the text's own logic, the only way left to save the planet and the future of the human race from being consumed entirely by the Nephilim. According to the texts, the giants actually saw the end coming. The Book of Giants describes prophetic dreams had by Nephilim leaders named Mahweh, Ohia, and Hahia. They dreamed of a great tablet inscribed with names being submerged in water, with only a few names surviving. They dreamed of a massive garden being destroyed, with only one tree spared. In their panic, they sought out the patriarch Enoch, who had already been taken up by God, and begged him to intercede for them. God denied their request for mercy. He instructed the archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel to bind the Watchers. They were cast into a dark subterranean abyss, held there until the final day of judgment. As the fountains of the great deep broke open and the floodwaters rose, the physical bodies of the Nephilim were finally destroyed. The earth was, in a sense, purged of the hybrid infection. But their physical destruction gave rise to something worse. According to the Book of Enoch, once the giants' bodies were drowned, their eternal hybrid souls had nowhere to go. Because they weren't purely human, they couldn't descend into the standard afterlife of Sheol. Because they were born of a rebellion against heaven, they couldn't ascend there either. They were trapped. They became disembodied, wandering spirits. The Book of Enoch explicitly states that these invisible, ravenous spirits of the dead giants are the same entities the New Testament later calls demons, or unclean spirits. They survived the flood, not in body, but in spirit, and kept plaguing and oppressing humankind long after the waters receded. This shift in understanding of the spiritual realm, the origin of demons, and the real cause of human corruption is exactly where the story takes its most consequential turn, because the religious authorities who came later eventually recognized the theological danger of this exact narrative, and what they did next erased it from the Western world for over 1,000 years. If you had walked into a gathering of the earliest Christians in the 1st or 2nd century, the Book of Enoch wasn't treated as a fringe or conspiracy text. It wasn't hidden in the back of the room. It was widely regarded, openly read, and taken seriously. It heavily influenced early Christian literature and shaped the theological framework behind parts of the New Testament itself. In fact, the canonical Epistle of Jude, found right before the Book of Revelation in your Bible, directly quotes the Book of Enoch. In Jude 1:14-15, the apostle writes, "Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone." This is a direct quotation from the opening chapters of 1st and Enoch. It shows that the apostles and early Christian communities viewed Enoch with real scriptural authority. They treated it as legitimate prophecy. Beyond that, major early church figures, men who helped shape the foundation of the faith, drew on this book. Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Clement of Alexandria all used the Book of Enoch to explain the origin of demons and the corruption of the ancient world. The theologian Tertullian defended it directly, arguing it was genuinely written by the ancient patriarch and preserved through the flood by Noah. Even the most recurring title used for Jesus Christ throughout the Gospels, the Son of Man, was a concept first developed in the Book of Parables within the Book of Enoch. So how does a book this foundational to the early church, a book quoted by biblical authors, simply vanish from the Christian Bible? It wasn't lost. It was deliberately removed by institutional councils. As the church grew in political power and centralized its authority through the 3rd and 4th centuries, theological debates began to threaten the institution's stability. A significant shift occurred in how church fathers read the book of Genesis. Led by thinkers like Julius Africanus and later solidified by Augustine of Hippo, the church began pushing a new doctrine known as the Sethite view. This view claimed that the sons of God in Genesis 6 weren't angels at all, just the righteous human descendants of Seth. The daughters of men were simply the wicked human descendants of Cain. Under this cleaner theory, the giants became the result of bad marriages between believers and non-believers, and the supernatural, angelic elements dropped out of the story entirely. Why push this new theory? Because the Book of Enoch had caused a real doctrinal crisis. Orthodox Christian doctrine rested almost entirely on the idea of exclusive human responsibility for sin. Man fell in the garden, man sinned through his own free will, and man alone needs redemption for it. But Enoch tells a disruptive story. It attributes the widespread, global spread of extreme evil to active angelic interference. It points to a contested reality where cosmic forces, forbidden knowledge, and rogue celestial beings actively interfered in human affairs. The institutional church couldn't allow a narrative where humanity was, in some sense, a victim of angelic warfare. The blame for the world's corruption needed to rest on human shoulders alone. The idea that demons were the disembodied spirits of dead giant hybrids came to be seen as too superstitious and too threatening to the orderly theology being built under Roman authority. So the truth got buried. Around 363 to 364 CE, church leaders convened the Council of Laodicea. Their goal was to set a strict, authorized list of canonical books to be read in the churches. The Book of Enoch was placed on the chopping block and officially excluded. By the end of the 4th century, the church had effectively condemned the text, labeling it heretical and apocryphal. They stopped copying it. They stopped referencing it. Centuries later, Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin followed the same path, deliberately leaving Enoch out to keep distance between their reformed canon and anything they saw as overtly mystical or unverified. The Watchers were erased from mainstream teaching. the Nephilim were downgraded to a historical footnote. The fact that an ancient civilization had once held forbidden, world-altering knowledge got buried along with them. They nearly succeeded in wiping it off the face of the earth, but they failed to destroy every copy. Deep in the Horn of Africa, isolated from the theological dictates of Rome and Constantinople, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church refused to fall in line with the councils. They maintained an unusually rich biblical tradition, keeping a canon of 81 books, and they considered the Book of Enoch to be genuinely inspired scripture. They translated it into their sacred liturgical language of Ge'ez and folded it directly into their Bible. For over 1,000 years, while the Western world forgot the book even existed, Ethiopian priests guarded the only complete manuscript of the Watcher's descent. It wasn't until 1773 that a Scottish explorer named James Bruce travelled to Ethiopia, discovered this ancient canon, and brought 3 copies of the Book of Enoch back to Europe. Western scholars were stunned, but the academic skepticism began almost immediately, because the book contained such strikingly accurate prophecies about the coming Messiah. Secular scholars and institutional theologians tried to dismiss it as a later forgery. They argued it had to have been written well after the time of Jesus Christ, by Christians retroactively justifying their faith. They didn't want to accept it as a genuine, ancient Jewish text. Then came 1947. In a dusty cave in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea, Bedouin shepherds stumbled onto the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. When scholars later excavated Qumran Cave 4, they found thousands of ancient manuscript fragments. Right there, sitting among the oldest biblical texts ever discovered, were preserved Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch. The Dead Sea Scrolls quieted the critics. Carbon dating and paleographic analysis confirmed the antiquity of the text, showing its earliest sections went back as far as the 3rd century BCE, hundreds of years before Jesus Christ was even born. The Ethiopian church had been right all along. Proof of this suppressed history had, in a sense, risen straight out of the desert. The real tragedy of this suppressed history isn't just that a group of ancient bishops managed to hide a book. It's that by erasing this text, they blinded us to the reality of our own past and to the cyclical nature of our future. When we look at the ancient mythologies of the world, the Greek tales of titans and demigods coming down from the sky, the Sumerian epics of heroes with supernatural strength, the legends of magical artifacts and cosmic wars, we're conditioned to treat them as primitive fiction. We write them off as the imagination of ancient people who didn't understand the weather. But the Book of Enoch forces a different reading. Those myths might not be fiction at all. They could be the fragmented memories of a global civilization that actually existed, a world where human beings wielded forbidden celestial science, where rogue cosmic entities broke the boundaries of creation to hand humanity the exact tools needed for its own destruction. The Watchers didn't just teach us how to forge metal, mix chemicals, or read the stars. They showed us how thin the boundary is between the physical, earthly dimension and the heavenly realm, and how vulnerable that boundary is to manipulation. As modern humanity advances rapidly into genetic modification, artificial intelligence, and quantum physics, the real question isn't whether humanity will ever possess godlike abilities again. It's whether we're currently uncovering the exact same forbidden science that once caused the Great Flood. And that connects to something bigger that most people miss when they study the Book of Enoch. Because the Watchers didn't just reveal the secrets of the earth. Enoch's visions took him far beyond our atmosphere, describing a cosmic reality that goes past modern astronomy. If this history interested you, the Book of Enoch goes much further into what's actually happening in the vastness of space. The Book of Enoch says we will lead to about life on other planets, and describes the reality, goes even deeper into these suppressed cosmic visions. Click the video on your screen right now to see it.